Welcome everybody to this Edge of Mind podcast, where my guest today is an individual I've been really waiting to talk to for quite some time. The scholar, polymath, general, all-round good guy, Jeffrey Kripal. So here's the introduction, and then we're just going to jump in, I think, into a host of compelling topics. So Jeffrey R. Kripal is the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, where he co-hosts the Archives of the Impossible Collection and conference series. He also co-directs the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. This, by the way, Jeffrey, is where we were supposed to meet about some 5 years ago
Oh,
when Michael and company were there, but in the last second you had to cancel because of academic obligations. But anyway, Jeff is the author of numerous books, most recently, How to Think Impossibly, about souls, UFOs, time, belief, and everything else. This is what we're going to focus on today. He is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal occurrence in the sciences, modern esoteric literature, and the hidden history of science fiction, collectively entitled The Super Story, Science, Fiction, and Some Emergent Mythologies. And my favorite part, I just love this, he thinks he may be Spider-Man.
yeah.
I think you are, Jeffrey. I think what you're doing here is weaving a web of sanity and clear thinking. So I do think you're an intellectual Spider-Man. And I have to say at the outset, I just love your work. And this book just blew me away, the one I want to focus on. I found it unbelievably insightful, rigorous, thorough. I found it profound, and almost the highest point was it was just funny as hell. Your writing is so clever. Your way with words, you're a fantastic wordsmith. I wonder if you're a Gemini, actually. Not that I know anything about astrology, but I mean, here's just one of them. There's so many memes here, right? I mean, here's one that just I said I love this guy. Laughter is philosophically important. I mean, like, how beautiful is that? So maybe we can start there. Just on a lighter note, to kind of set the ground for taking playful but concerted and incisive stabs at this thing called reality, science, scientism, metaphysics, our beliefs. And so I want to start, maybe at the lighter, more shallower end of the pool. And like with your work, explore what you're doing at the deepest ends as a really profound, I think of it as Obamacare, the Republicans trying to repeal and replace.
Right.
Well, you have a fantastic repeal and replace strategy here to overthrow the tyranny of materialism and all that. And so I want to get to that deeper end. But maybe let's talk really the importance of humor, liquidity, laughter, cracking up, breaking up. Because this is no small thing. It's a very powerful weapon. It's a disarming weapon, this thing called lightheartedness and humor. And you embody it. I have to say, I love your books because of this. So let's start with something on the light end.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew. I mean, obviously, I mean, I can tell within a few seconds whether somebody's read the books or not. I mean, I really can. And I'm not saying that out of any kind of arrogance. It's just obvious to me. And the fact that you honed in on humor is really good. I mean, it's clear evidence to me. I mean that. I mean that metaphysically.
Wow.
That's not a throwaway line. If people are too serious, I get worried. I really get worried. And I teach, what we banally call reflexivity, the ability to step out of oneself and to look at one's thoughts and beliefs in a critical and playful fashion. And I think that's the essence of humor. Is that ability. You can't laugh at something if you're in it, if you are it, right?
Yeah.
You can only laugh at something if you're in it, but you're not in it. And it's that kind of both and that I'm really after. I'm like, come on, let's think about this, but let's also be playful and let's stand outside it as well. And so that I think and I do try to be funny. I mean, my joke is, 20 years ago, I got tired of writing for 50 people in the world, 25 of whom hate me. And that's really the definition of academic writing right there. And I was like, oh, screw
Yeah.
that. That's
Yeah.
it's not any good. And I read this author named Charles Fort.
Oh
And
yeah, totally. Oh, cool.
well,
Yeah.
Fort is funny. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really funny. And I was like, oh my God, you can do this in a way I think he wanted to be Mark Twain, is what I really think um, Charles Fort wanted to do or be. And so I try to embody that humor as a philosophical tool, as you're saying.
Yeah.
It's not minor.
It's not minor. And it's also indicative of just a whip smart intelligence, right? I mean, you listen to Robin Williams or Stephen
Yeah,
Colbert or
yeah,
Jon Stewart. I mean, these guys are smart, right? And so they have this incredible incisive capacity to take stabs. And it's so fundamentally disarming because how do you defend against these spot on humorous attacks? And etymologically, I love wordplay. And we'll tie this in later to how etymology connects to entomology. I mean, some of the stuff you write about bugs, and this book is just like such a mind F, right? But
yeah,
so etymologically, not entomologically, the root of the word humor, as you know, is or laughter, humor is liquidity, fluidity. And so there's something about a liquid flowing, or I kind of roll in the Buddhist world, an emptiness approach. This is one way to really take a very healthy but yet playful stab in a very powerful, disarming way to make us look at our follies. I'm Longchenpa, one of the great Mahasiddhas in Tibetan Buddhism, the Dzogchen master, once says something to the effect of, the whole thing is just so ridiculous, we might as well just burst out laughing. I mean, that was like his lifetime statement. So with that said, I love it. But so a couple things here, I have to say, so much to say here. One of the challenges in the scope of your work, we're going to focus on how to think impossibly, but like the flip, which I also really loved, and these other books, there's so much terrain here. But this notion of thinking, boy, let's go after it a little bit. I'm reminded of a beautiful quote by the Nobel laureate physicist, Brian Josephson. You may have heard it, but if not, I love it. We think that we think clearly, but that's only because we don't think clearly. I mean,
I haven't heard that one. I like it though.
it's just like fantastic. And so I'm going to do the paraphrasing from your own words about this book. And then I want you to throw a dart at like what really inspired you to write this. And then we can get into some deeper stuff. But at the outset, and I thought this was so great from you, this book is about why humanities must stop ceding reality to the sciences. I mean, high five. And what immediately came to mind is this playful maxim, if you can't count, you don't count. And there's something about the humanities, right? You don't count because you can't count. And talk about hubris, talk about myopia, talk about the ensconcement of belief systems. So talk to us a little bit about what fundamentally inspired you to write this magnificent book, and then we'll get into some of the weeds into it.
Yeah. So I wrote a book before this called The Superhumanities. And the basic argument of that book is that really what thinking is, or the humanities is again, um, is a series of altered states that then inspire new thought. And it's not that thinking isn't about words and syllogisms and kind of care and work, but that it initiates in these altered states. And that if you ignore these altered states or you reduce them to hallucination or mental illness or all the things that people do, you're fundamentally misreading and misunderstanding the nature of human thought. And so what happened, Andrew, was my editor at the University of Chicago Press, a guy named Kyle, he said to me, he says, well, why don't you just call this new book How to Think Impossibly? And I was like, oh, that's a great title. And of course, it feeds into what I call the impossible. And so I really wrote the book around this conception of thinking impossibly. And thinking impossibly is basically how to do the superhumanities. It's how to acknowledge altered states as the source of new knowledge, but they're not sufficient in themselves, of course. But they require people who are comfortable with words and language to come in and essentially pull out what the implications of these altered states are. And so thinking impossibly, let me go back. Let me just try to define it. Thinking impossibly is not reducing a phenomenon to either a religion or science. It's not. This is where it's very Fortean. It's not reducing it to something we're comfortable with or something we've done. It's sitting with it. It's sitting with the experiencer and thinking with, as I say, with a hyphen, around these altered states, and not being comfortable with the religious interpretations or the scientific neuroscientific ones, which is what people commonly do. So that's not about certainty or a comfort level. I mean, it's a kind of open-endedness, and I don't have any certainty or conviction to give the reader, but there is an invitation towards thinking into the future there.
Yeah, this is really great. And I think right at the outset, boy, we're hitting on some cool things because impossible by whose standards? And
Yeah,
one thing here
right,
that I'm immediately
right.
triggered a little bit with, in a positive sense, is even when we talk about altered states. I think my conjecture, Jeffrey, and I'm curious how this lands with you. This is the altered state.
Yeah, right,
What we're talking about here is
right,
really intimations of the natural state, and maybe this is where we can go. We can use these intimations of the paranormal, of the impossible, as indicators. This is the brilliance of your book, as indicators for a profound flip. So this is a flip. What in fact constitutes the altered state? And so the
right.
hubris of saying, "Oh, these weird," and I love this line again. There's so many memes. The weirder it is, the truer it is. I mean, I can't tell you how often I use that because I live in the world of high strangeness.
Right,
It's just
right.
like this is where I roll, the shamans and the mystics and the liminal beings. And so let's talk a little bit about that. And also, what Alan Watts, I think it was Alan Watts, talked about the wisdom of uncertainty. Zen talks about it as the don't know mind. Dafri John talked about divine ignorance. The ability or lack thereof for thinkers, and unfortunately, especially intellectual, what Dafri John called the solid types, the scientific mind that I think reifies, concretizes, and solidifies. I think underneath it all, for psychological reasons, based on fear of the groundlessness of the empty nature. If you don't have anything solid to stand on, that's really highly disquieting. And so I think underneath it all, to throw in yet another topic to discuss, I think there's fundamental, profound psychological undercurrents involved here on the resistance to these types of things. That it really, this type of uncertainty, this lack of articulation and ambiguity, is highly disconcerting to the solidified, reified, concretized scientific intellectual mind. So I'm throwing a lot of noodles here, but let's run with some of these.
Well, again, I think that's right. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about all that. I'm not certainly in this book, but really in all the books, I'm not proposing something that will be voted on successfully tomorrow. It's I always use these two hands. There's what people want to hear or can hear, and then there's what's actually so. And those can be completely different. And I'm trying to get at what is actually so. And but I'm speaking in terms of what people can hear. So I'm sitting in the middle. I'm a teacher by trade and or by profession. And so I do think we need to communicate, but we don't have to assume that what we're saying, it's not like a secret. I can whisper a piece of content to you and suddenly it's like you actually can't know it because you're not in that state of mind or that state of consciousness. And of course, I come at this as a historian of religions, as somebody who's very aware of other cultural frameworks and other religious traditions. And by other, I mean many, many others. And I know that what's altered or what's impossible in one cultural context is not impossible or weird in another. I totally get that. And what I mean by the impossible is not that it's impossible, but it's impossible in the framework of our present or whatever
Right.
the worldview is. It's calling it that.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm trying to break open that and comparison or a kind of global view of things is crucial to this, but it's precisely what we don't have in these hard types that you're mentioning, or that Dr. John was mentioning. They're certain that they know how the world works, and they're going to tell you, like, okay.
Well, decades ago, Sam Keen, he had this wonderful little line that whenever you have the urge to bang your fist down on the table and say, that's just the way it is, that's your first clue that you're up against a blind spot, a belief system, and that kind of conviction, certainty is indicative, in fact, of a closed-mindedness. So you mentioned a term that you write about in the book that I had not heard of before, which I really appreciated, present and presentism.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about the dangers of presentism and what that actually is.
Yeah. So I'll talk about it in two ways. I'll just give a definition, an abstract definition, and I'll tell a story. So presentism comes from philosophy of science, and it essentially says that any scientific framework is based on present knowledge, and that it's almost certainly a mistake to assume that the science of the time, whatever the time is complete or correct. That things will change, and that there will be a new scientific or new naturalist understanding of the world. And so that's where the word comes from. Where I use it a lot. So I tell all my graduate students that they don't have any business studying religion until they've lost two worldviews.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's beautiful.
And they look at me and I'm like, look, if you have not lost any worldview because you assume the world is as you've grown up with it or as you've been taught it, you can't study other people's views of the world that are very different, because you'll just assume that they're wrong or that they're mistaken. And if you've lost one world, the chances are very strong that you've just fallen into another. And it's almost certainly secularism or this presentist scientism, this idea that we know how the world works now. And I'm like, well, when you lose that world, you're going to think twice about jumping into a third worldview.
Yeah.
And it's at that point that you become an intellectual, I think. You start to question those assumptions. And it's at that point you can also start to think impossibly, I think, to use the language of this particular book. So yeah, presentism is simply the idea that our present knowledge of the world is incomplete, and that it's of the present, and that it'll look very different in a century or even a decade or even a couple of years, depending on how quickly things move or don't move.
Exactly. Or don't move. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So there are a couple of things here that were really just spot on. One is the questions are really more important than answers, right? The Socratic method, the power of proper inquiry, investigation, sending the mind in proper directions. I mean, arguably the most important thing. And then secondly, along these lines, Jeffrey, I love our mutual friend David Loy writes about this beautifully, how we have this unquestioned axiomatic view, at least some do, of the alleged neutrality of secularism.
Yeah.
That somehow the secular is itself, oh, this is secular, it's neutral, it's the base, we can all be secular. But this is yet another attempt to throw some rug or a ground underneath otherwise very shifting sands. And so what David writes about, and you intimate this beautifully, is that even this alleged neutrality of secularism is in fact not that. Even that is a construct and a way to slide a belief system underneath our shifting feet to create a sense of ground.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, David's right. And I'm trying to, the superhumanities and impossible thinking it's not about a rejection of critical theory or the questions of the humanities or the sciences. It's an embrace of them and a kind of attempt to create some more comprehensive or bigger picture that can incorporate those. So it's secularism is it's a tricky thing because like the study of religion that I'm in is not even possible without secularism. I mean, our ancestors were burned in squares, screaming in fires and thrown in prison. And so secularism, or the move away from religious belief and religious certainty, was a very good thing, for human thought. On the other hand, it itself becomes a dogma.
Exactly.
And that's where I think, I call it the humanist secret. You begin to question these assumptions because they're clearly assumptions. They're clearly beliefs and not established truths. And the other thing, that the deeper thing, Andrew, and I think you'll totally grok this from your Buddhist perspective. Sometimes I'm heard as being anti-science or anti-secular.
Right.
And I'm not. I want science to be science and I want secularism to be secularism, and not to pretend that it speaks of all of reality. And my critique of the scientific method is not that it's the scientific method. Of course we should have that. And of course we should. I take vaccines and I drive a vehicle. I have Eric. I do all the things that, a scientific secular person wants. On the other hand, I don't think reality is ultimately dualistic like that. I don't think it's about a subject knowing a set of dead, insentient objects. I think there's something essentially non-dual, to go back to our friend David Lloyd, that is essentially true. It's the way things are. And so I'm not just suspicious of thinking. I don't think thinking can get there.
That's it.
And I think what we call apophatic mystical literature, I think really is the key here.
Yeah.
But it's not about knowing something in a logical or objective or a rational fashion. It's about becoming something that you already are.
Yeah.
And this gets back to things you've said before, of course. But so the critique is not just superficial. It kind of goes to the heart of what we mean by reality and what we mean by a knower.
Yeah, now we're starting to get into the waters I was hoping we could go to. But a couple of things here, Jeffrey, that came to mind, and I'm so delighted to hear what you said about I don't think thinking can get us here. As you probably know, if not, it's worth knowing in the Indic pedagogical approaches of both Hinduism and Buddhism, they have a very nuanced, sophisticated approach of the incorporation of knowledge and then actually the transformation of knowledge into wisdom. This becomes really important in this age of AI, where we confuse information for experience, we get completely lost.
Right.
At that level, that's another dimension to really explore. But they talk about, very elegantly paraphrasing it, about the tripartite approach of hearing, contemplating, meditating. In my languaging, ingest, digest, metabolize, transform cerebral data into somatic fiber so that the teachings literally become you. And so I think this is fantastic. And so I playfully suggest for your next book, I thought about this, to propose to your publishers, either how to stop thinking entirely or how to transcend but include thinking. Right?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think the latter is doable. At least in a book that's words, right? I mean, come on. I mean, here's the other thing, though. Let me add this, and this is really key to the book. So, paranormal phenomena, visionary experiences, precognitive experiences, telepathic experiences, are often actually dismissed or set aside by the contemplative traditions, as you know. I personally think that's a mistake. I think that these experiences are trying to speak to us, and they're trying to speak in the only ways that they have at their disposal, which is stories or visions, and that we should listen. And by listening, I don't mean literally believing, but I mean listening.
Mm.
And what religious people do, well, so first of all, secular people completely reject these experiences and say they didn't happen. Well,
Right.
they did. I'm sorry, they did. They happened. Um, so I'm setting aside that response, but then the religious response is good in the sense that it says, okay, these things happen, but it's bad in the sense of now, and we know what they are. These are demons, or this is, something to be rejected on the contemplative path or whatever. I'm like, no, don't do that. Don't
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
Um, listen. And when I sit down with experiencers, their near-death experience or their dream or their vision or whatever, it's often the most important thing that ever happened to them. This is not tangential to human beings. This is at the core. And it's not that the experiencer knows what the experience is about. This is what I'm trying to get at. They want writers and intellectuals and thinkers to think with them. They don't want to be thought about. They don't want to be told what it is. They want someone to work with and someone to articulate what this might be about. And again, I think we're always, Andrew, I think this is the other thing. I think we're always caught in a narrative or a story, but I think that's part of being human, and that's what it's about. We're here to tell stories and to live out stories, but also to question stories and to say, okay, well, this story isn't working so, and so what is this new story going to be about? And that's really what the book also is about, is how do we tell a new story? And it's not that there's a singular story to tell, but all of these stories have this larger context too,
Yeah.
so it's it's to kind of go to cosmology. I mean, the fact that there's no single position where we can say that this is what space and time are doesn't mean that all bets are off. I mean, relativity theory is a universal cosmic theory. It's a story of the whole shebang. And it works for all these different perspectives. And so there's a kind of multiplicity embedded in it, but there's also a kind of unity embedded in it. And I really want to hold both of those for the humanities as well. I don't want us to do the postmodern thing and say all meta narratives are out. I mean, like, no, sorry, that doesn't help. But it doesn't mean any of these local narratives are universally applicable and useful for everyone too.
Yeah, that's so spot on. This is exactly where I was going to ask you to go, because we can tell a different story. The world is made of stories. David wrote a book by that title. And so the question is, in fact, say a little bit more about the near enemy of radical relativism and postmodernism. How do we, is it a free for all? Is there an irreducible reduction base to this? I mean, how much of a sliding scale do we have in terms of our storytellings? And in fact, can there be this whole notion of absolute truth? Is there actually something like that in your worldview, or is even the
Yeah.
absolute itself a story?
Yeah. So the way I talk about that is, so what the relativists lack is a vertical dimension, just to kind of use a metaphor. They're really good about the horizontal and about contextualizing and historicizing everything. And I'm all for that. I mean, I reduce everything from Christmas to Wednesday. I can do that. That's like cool. That's great. And it's true. However, there are these verticalities that are not talked about. And this is where the form of absolute truth comes in. You know, and this is where the Buddhists, I mean, come in too. There's conventional truth, right?
Yep.
Then there's absolute, or there's truth, true truth, and they're different. They're not the same. Um, and so that's kind of where I go with this, is these two orders of truth. And I think both are true. And I live and I love the academy. Because I'm very comfortable in that among intellectuals and among scientists and social scientists and historians. I'm very comfortable, but I don't think that they're adequate. Those models are not adequate. Um, so it's a kind of both and, Andrew, is what I'm trying to say.
Totally, totally. So, Jeffrey, I'm curious. One thing I have not noticed in your work, and I'm sure you're aware of it, but I'm curious why you're not overtly an integralist.
Yeah,
Because equal theory, I have to say, full disclosure, I'm a lifetime, very close friend of Ken Wilber. The
yeah,
whole integral thing, I have to say, it has so much explanatory power.
yeah,
And like, for instance, here, I mean, just page 171 in your book, there's so many intimations of integral theory, but there's no overt allegiance to it I wouldn't say recognition. You talk on page 171 about the outside of reality and then the inside of reality. Well, as you know, what integral theory does so beautifully is talks about the inside and the outside of the individual and the collective. And to me, there's a lot of elegance to this type of integral model. So I'm really quite curious why you don't reference that more overtly, or how even the integral approach relates to your worldview.
yeah. So a couple things there. I mean, I've thought a lot about that, as you could
Okay.
imagine, including I've read a lot of Ken Wilber, by the way. I mean, I wrote a whole book on the Esalen Institute, you know.
Totally. Exactly.
I know that world really well. A couple things. First of all, I've also been criticized, I think justly, for not tending to transpersonal psychology enough. I mean, this is another gap. Um, there are a couple, like, I have a couple responses to that. Neither one of them really answer the critic. I just sit with the criticism, like, yeah, that's true. That's the case. One is a question of audience.
Uh,
I really want to address other academics,
got it.
and invoking Ken Wilber's integralism or transpersonal psychology is a great way not to be heard.
Yeah, exactly. Why is that? Say more about why is that, Jeffrey?
Well, they did not. I mean, I can't speak. I'm not going to speak about
Yeah,
Ken.
I don't mean to, and I'll put
Well,
this
they
to,
didn't. I don't think they really conversed with academics.
that's it.
I think they went around it, which is okay. I mean, that worked for them, but as a result, it didn't get, lack of a better word, integrated into the academic discussion. Um, and so one is just audience. The other is, this is more philosophical and going to be a little harsher. I don't actually like integration.
Huh.
I I think human beings are who are really messed up are way more interesting than human beings who are integrated. I'm like, one of the things I tell my graduate students, I so hope you're fucked up. I really want you to be messed up and not be, because if you are healthy and whole, you are not interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
And I talk a lot about something I call the traumatic secret. And the truth is, or the historical evidence is, that most paranormal phenomena and a lot of mystical experiences happen in severe trauma
Yeah.
or human suffering. And this is why they get read demonologically, by the way. It's because they're essentially suffering human beings. And so their cries of the heart for healing and wholeness. And I want to listen and take that suffering seriously, but also as an opening, because and I my fear about integral philosophy is that it's too whole.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It's and so that's a philosophical or a psychosocial reason. And I also, Andrew, to back up a bit, I really do operate with this idea that the mind or the brain, let's say the brain and the body, is a filter, is a mediation of some more cosmic form of mind or consciousness, but that you only have access to that mind at large when the body or the brain starts to break down or is compromised. In
Yeah.
general, I know there are exceptions to that. I get that. But a psychedelic state, a near-death state. These are by definition traumatic events on the body brain. And as a result, things open up. And what the reductionist says is, oh, well, that's just the psychedelic, or that's just the car that's wrapped around the oak tree. I'm like, no, 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 no. You are operating with the production model, and I'm operating with this reduction model, and they're completely different. And they're going to look at these traumas or these sufferings in very different ways. And so that's kind of a long answer to the integral philosophy question. There's not a Toyota wrapped around the oak tree, to put it bluntly.
Again, another one of these great lines. I have to say, you're like my root guru, the radical iconoclastic, way out of the box thinker, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, right? The
I
master, the
know.
comic of the one-liner. You've got as many as he does. And so, with that in mind,
Yeah.
the little notes I wrote down, in his famous words, chaos should be regarded as extremely good news. And so,
Yeah.
when I'm listening to you, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is really, really helpful to me. And this is one of the things that is actually my lifetime passion is it's not what you don't, Mark Twain, Josh Billings, who said it, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you do know that just ain't so. So I'm super interested in blind spots. Like what am I not seeing? And so, I drank the Buddhist Kool-Aid and I still do. It's still my main Kool-Aid. I love integral. It has a lot of explanatory power, but I'm just insatiably interested in truth and knowledge and like, what the hell am I not seeing? So here, let me paraphrase what I heard from you and then tell me if I'm wrong. That a near enemy of the brilliance, wherever you find light, you find shadows. And so a shadow of the integral thing, if I'm understanding you, is almost too articulate, too explanatory, too tidy, and too holistic. And so to me, I'm wondering if that resonates with you, that it has so much explanatory power on one level that strength then backfires and becomes this weakness, that it seems to attempt to out-contextualize everything. And therefore, in a certain way, can undermine its own credibility. So is that a reasonable way to paraphrase what you said, or am I missing something?
I don't know. So I'm not critical of integral philosophy per se, but I do think it's too healthy. It's too it emphasizes wholeness too much. I mean, I do think the world is one and that there is wholeness. I don't get me wrong. I do think that. But I think that human beings historically have access to that wholeness in states of disorder and states of suffering and states of, and meditation, to go back to your earlier comment, I mean, meditation is basically a kind of um, controlled trauma. I mean, you're stopping the brain and the body from doing what it wants to do, and um, that's wise. That's a wise thing to do, but it implies that the ordinary normal way of human functioning is not going to get us there. And I don't think it will actually. Um, so I don't know. And a lot of it too, Andrew, is just, again, I sit in the academy and I want to work from where I am, not from where I'm not. And I don't idolize that. It's not like I think that's somehow cool and great and the cat's meow. It just happens to be where I am and what I can do. And I know what to say and I know what not to say to be heard. I'll tell you a story. I was at an Eastern university, the East, it was in the Carolinas, and I for over a decade, I just walked into universities and I started to talk about weird shit. And but I did it in the language of the disciplines,
Beautiful.
of the
Yeah.
humanities, of the social sciences. And someone said to my host, I've never forgotten this. He said, that guy can make UFOs sound Ivy League.
Oh, wow. What a compliment.
And I was like, okay, that's the key right there.
Yeah.
And my experience of intellectuals is that academics are generally very receptive of these experiences, but they don't know how to talk about it. And so what I'm trying to do is here is how you talk about it.
Okay.
And so it gets back to your earlier question too, is like, why do you not express yourself in these other terms? Well, it's my audience.
Yeah.
It's a strategic thing. And maybe it's not thought out, Andrew. I'm not consciously not doing that. Um,
Well, it makes tremendous sense to me, Jeffrey. It's
yeah,
really, really articulate. And so there's two things I want to hit on. One is I want to talk a little bit maybe after the next topic about UFOs and because you just did this big event on it. WTF are these phenomena? I'm just really, really interested in what you have to say here because you're one of the leading voices. But just to make sure we get to this topic, because to me this was the juice of your work. This incredible chapter in your book, "The World is One and the Human is Two."
yeah,
This is just so bloody brilliant. I just wanted to jump up at every paragraph and just give you a big hug. So let me just share a little bit of my understanding, and then I want you to run with this because this was like crux of the book for me, was that these experiences of the paranormal, again, paranormal in relationship to what standard of normalcy. So there's that
yeah,
question.
right,
Like you say so beautifully, well, these sorts of paranormal phenomena are in fact paranormal, but only within the context, the paradigm of a dualistic, materialistic worldview. And so
right,
again, in this repeal and replace strategy, if you really pay attention to this data, these are massive, relentless assaults on this axiomatic, dualistic, materialistic worldview. And so where this book just explodes for me is when you talk about non dual aspect monism, which by the way, I'm wondering if the languaging spectral monism might be a little bit more elegant, because I think even the dual aspect tends to denote a binary intimation around it. But
yeah,
the relationship of dual aspect monism to idealism, because that's the flip. I mean, that's the overthrowing the tyranny of materialism,
yeah.
flipping it into an idealistic worldview. So, can you say a little bit more about this really, really elegant rendering, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps came from Spinoza, but you're the philosopher here, I'm not. So, talk to us a little bit about decompositional dual aspect monism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, well, you referenced a couple times this book, The Flip, and that's that's another piece I wrote. That'll take us far afield, but it's basically about these philosophical options. Now, dual aspect monism for me is a sort of Western version of non-dualism, by the way. Um, and essentially, what it says, though, it's very helpful though, because what it says is that there's this fundamental ground of reality that is neither mental nor material, or it's both at the same time, however we want to talk about it. And that it splits up into human experience. This is the decompositional part. It splits up into human experience as an external set of objects and an internal set of states or mentalities. the re so the reason I like it is that it acknowledges that dualism is built into our ordinary experience and into our science, including our science and our secularism, that this notion of an internal viewer of an external world is just basic to having a body and being a human being, but that it's grounded in this deeper super source or this deeper super reality. And I really like that model because it explains things to me like synchronicity, which I hear all the time from people, where something is happening in the material world that corresponds pretty much perfectly to something that's happening in the internal world. And I'm thinking to myself, well, of course it corresponds. It split off of the same reality, you know? So dual aspect monism really helps me think through these impossible experiences in a way that I find really, really useful. Another way that I put this is, what does the universe have to look like to make these impossible experiences possible? Well, it has to look like this. It has to look something like this. And I understand that there are different interpretations of this non-dualism. There are different interpretations of dual aspect monism. But I'm like, well, let's have that conversation. Let's be part of that that debate. Certainly don't know. And Spinoza, by the way, to go back to Spinoza, whom I've read a lot, he didn't have the phrase dual aspect monism, by the way. It came later. He didn't even have the word pantheism, but he did have this notion of Deus sive natura, that he, as he put it, that the reality is God or nature. That when it's seen externally and mathematically or geometrically, it's nature, but when it's seen internally within an experience, it's Deus, it's God, and it's that both and that I really like. But I'm not bound to Spinoza. I mean, I think there are lots of non-dual or dual aspect monist thinkers, and they're all valuable, and they do slide into idealism, in my opinion. I mean, this does slide that way. My dual aspect monism is tentative, and it's an upaya, to use the Buddhist term. It's a method or a way of talking. It's not a conclusion or a final conviction.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, can you say a little bit more about? God, there's so many wonderful things to unpack here. But idealism, and I love what is your line? I just loved it. God is idealism for the masses, or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
That's another one. High
yeah.
five, bro. I mean, that's just like bloody
We
beautiful.
should make some T-shirts, Andrew.
I
We
mean,
should put those on T-shirts.
fantastic. I just love that stuff. So talk to us a little bit about the relationship, because we're circumambulating some really core topics that are pretty hip these days, right? The non-dual thing is it's having a little bit of a renaissance these days with our mutual friend Bernardo Kastrup, and then
Yeah,
his buddy
yeah.
Lyra, Swami Sarvapriyananda. The whole Advaita thing is coming back in a beautiful full force. So can you say a little bit more about the relationship you're intimating yet of dual aspect monism, idealism, and then also I'm curious about the relationship in the place of panentheism for you, because if, like I mentioned in one of my first email correspondence to you, one of my subscriptions, right? The models I subscribe to, dual aspect monism for sure. It has so much power for me. And then also panentheism. So I know I'm throwing out some geek speak here, but I think these terms can help us understand some of the real core aspects of your work.
Yeah. Um, I can. I mean, I can speak to that. So idealism is the position that ultimate reality is mind, and that matter is some kind of manifestation or emanation of mind. The reason that dual aspect monism, I think, does slide into that is that this super ground, to call it neither mental nor material, is also to come up with some other term. There is some um, aspect to this that feeds into mind or consciousness, as it's talked about in Buddhist and Hindu non-dualism. I really do think that dual aspect monism can become a kind of idealism, but we have to be careful with idealism. We don't just mean mind as you and I are in right now. We mean some kind of super mind. Um, God. So I want to, again, I'm a comparativist. And I think of somebody like Camus here, when they asked him, or they said, "Well, you're an atheist," and he said, "No, I'm not." But that doesn't mean he didn't reject people's images of God. But it meant at the end of the day, he didn't reject that people have this experience of God, or of some being that is the supermind, as it were. And so what panentheism is, it's a kind of, to me, it's a kind of bridge between um, naturalism and pantheism,
Ooh.
or pantheism and theism. There is a God, but God's body is the world, but God is also more than the world. God is more than the natural world. And again, these are all tentative positions for me personally, just because I don't know, Andrew. I'm not trying to be coy or savvy. I'm just like, well, I don't know whether ultimate reality is shunyata or emptiness or deus or God. I mean, maybe it's both, depending on your perspective or your experience. But at the end of the day, I mean, what I really do think is that we, I don't know how to say this. We are we imagine we experience what we imagine. I think science essentially proves science. It's just like this circular machine. And I think Buddhism, different forms of Buddhism, they just prove Buddhism. They go around and around and around. And the same with Hinduism, the same with whatever tradition we want to name, that there's something about human beings that projects these stories into the physical environment and then experiences those stories as literally or physically true.
Yeah.
And this is where it slides into idealism, by the way. I mean, I do sort of think that, but that's a tentative kind of guess. It's not a conviction. So, for example, people really experience characters they've written about, or figures in popular culture, or religious mythology. They really have these experiences. So there's something about physical reality that feeds back on us and presents itself in whatever we're imagining. And I think the UFO, by the way, to go to another, is like this. I think it's feeding back to us that it's a technology or that it's about spacecraft. Right? I think that is our mythology. That is where we're at, and so that's what's appearing to us.
Fantastic. So, in the time that we have left, and I know we have a time limitation, I want to basically talk about two things. So,
Okay.
I will allot whatever you think is most important time-wise to go. One is I want to talk a little bit, if time allows for you, about this UFO thing,
Yeah.
because this is such a mind F, right? Both
Yeah.
material and non-material, they're demonic in nature. They're just so
Yeah.
great in this regard, and,
Right.
and with all the press and the military and everybody is in a kerfuffle because they just don't know what to do with these things, which I think is their message. So that's one thing. I know you're really big on that, and you write about it so beautifully. But maybe to close, so I allow you to allocate the time that you feel is important. You're intimating this, but I want to see how it's really working in your life. How has your research and your work changed you? I mean, how has this work come back to inform and transform the way you live your life and the way you basically view reality? So that may be the penultimate question. So I allow you whatever you think in terms of allocation of time. I'd love to hear you say a little bit about both of those.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the latter because I think it's more important. Um, I feel very lonely, Andrew. Um, I think being open-ended and questioning is a very unpopular thing to be. And I think it's very hard. Um, I think, though, the academy sometimes rewards that. And so, again, I exist in a professional world that encourages and rewards what it is I do. I sort of backed into it. And I think a lot of us back into particularly the study of religion. We start out as deeply religious and having religious questions, and then the religious tradition can't answer those questions or won't answer those questions. And we back into a discipline that will ask them and reward some kind of tentative answers. So how have I been transformed? I feel that what I think impossibly is very obvious, but also very lonely. That's a good, I think, a response to that question. The UFO, I love the UFO because it's where people are at. And I love the government and the military obsession with the UFO, again, because it's the government and the military obsession. I don't think they have a clue what's going on. They need somebody who knows something about the history of religious experience, not to tell them what's going on, because I don't know either, but to comment on these are clearly spiritual and parapsychological experiences as well as they are physical experiences. And it's that collapse or that conflation of something very physical and something very parapsychological or spiritual that personally draws me in, and I think draws a lot of people in to sort of like really engage this. So I actually love the UFO phenomenon, not because I understand it, but because I'm sure I don't understand it, and I'm positive nobody else does. Uh, to put it, but that's like really useful, right? That's like, and what's so amazing about the military people and the scientists is they let me say these things, and they really want to hear this. They're good people, Andrew. These are good, really good people, and I've learned that over the. I mean, not that I thought otherwise, but that's really been driven home to me over and over again. It's just the goodness of people and wanting to understand something that maybe as human beings we can't understand.
Well, or we can't understand through our particular paradigms. I mean, one of the things I had a recent conversation with Patrick Harper. I'm sure you're familiar
Yeah,
with.
yeah, I know Patrick's work.
Yeah, he's so cool. The whole notion of daimonic reality is really pretty brilliant. And so, in that languaging, these are daimonic entities, right? Neither physical nor material. They're here to do whatever, whether it's by design or serendipity or whatnot. But yeah, I see the great gift of this and other paranormal phenomena, like we started at the outset, to challenge, to dent this view of physicalism, materialism, and basically throw crowbars, right?
I mean, to just riff on that. I mean, I think maybe where I would differ with Patrick is I don't think these past mythologies have the answer either. I think those were how our ancestors framed it, and good for them. I mean, that trickster element or that demonic element is certainly true of the UFO phenomena. It's what gets erased or denied a lot, but it's obviously the case. So in that sense, Patrick is spot on. But I'm deeply suspicious of the previous religious mythologies and folklore too.
Hmm.
I think they were experiencing how they interpreted it, but that their interpretations and their cultural framings were local and relative too. So again, that's thinking impossibly. That's like, no, I'm not landing with the military or the government, but I'm also not landing with the shamans or the Christians or the Hindus or whatever. I mean, no, I'm not. I think it's weirder than that, and I want to just keep emphasizing that
Yeah.
weirdness.
I think it's fantastic and a great way to wrap things up because if there's one meta narrative that I'm hearing throughout this entire conversation in your work, it's what I playfully call the combustion cycle of the psychospiritual path is contraction and expansion. Because when you're thinking, these things are impossible within contracted Aristotelian ways of thinking, right? And so the fundamental message I'm left with here is, in fact, like Varela and other people write about Thompson, the power of an open question. Just the ability to say and actually appreciate that. There's something really delightful to anyone's sense of humor and delight. There's something so liberating when somebody asks me something and I can just say with full honesty, I don't know. It's so beautiful. It's like I have no effing idea. And so somehow underneath it all, again, not to put this in yet an outer explanatory contextual model, but there's something quite beautiful about just being open. Synonym for emptiness, by the way. In the world of emptiness, everything is possible. In the world without emptiness, nothing is possible. So in my framework, openness, emptiness, plasticity, maybe that's the non-bottom line.
Well, yeah, but it's also I think we have a really good sense of why things are open-ended. It's not just we're open for the sake of being open, but you really can't think this. You really can't. It's not about that. And that is you can't turn it into math. You can't quantify it. It just doesn't work. And that's shocking to people. That's truly shocking. But that's certainly what impossible thinking's about.
And it's precisely because of what I said earlier. It's because you can't count, it doesn't count. And so
Right.
you come back to that same sort of thing. So it's fantastic full circle. So Jeffrey, as we start to close up, we have a minute. Ways for people to get to know your work, to support you, to hear about you. Can you share a little bit more about your platforms and
Well, I don't I'm not very digitally savvy for strategic reasons, but jeffreyjkripal.com is the best sort of summary of the work. And you can see all the books listed there and go to wherever you buy books and find them. But that's really where I set out what I'm about on that website.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I know how bloody busy you are. This has been such a delight. I love your work. Nice to finally meet you in the appropriate cyberspace, and may our paths cross in this dimension and many others. And
We'll do it. We'll do it again, Andrew. I hope so.
carry on. Yeah. All the best to you, my friend. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.